welcome to another webinar of our Role to Play initiative. Thank you for joining us. Today we are here with macroeconomics professors Pedro Brinca and João Duarte for the second part of the Pandemonics series webinars. If you did not have the chance to watch the first part of this webinar, you can find it on our platform at rolltoplay.novasbe.pt. At that first part, we talked about the macroeconomic environment and the global impacts of the crisis. Today, we will focus on how this crisis is affecting the several industry and economic sectors, what can companies do, and what type of world can we expect from the post-COVID scenario. At the end of the presentation, we will have a small space for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom part of your screen. So now I leave you with João.
Okay. Thank you so much for tuning in to our Pandemonics 2.0. It's really a pleasure to be here, and we really appreciate you joining us and spending some time with us, even though virtually, during this very difficult time. You know, me and Pedro, we have basically three main objectives where we're going to try to, you know, provide some value added in terms of information and discussion and food for thought. Where the first objective is to provide sort of an overview of what are the main macro shocks and how they're mainly affecting some different parts of the economy. And the second objective is to discuss how these shocks are affecting, you know, different sectors of the economy, but also within each sector, how these shocks are, you know, affecting differently firms of these different sectors. And then finally, we're going to discuss a little bit what are the responses that firms should be looking to follow in order to, you know, adjust into this new reality, into this crisis, and what to look forward. So what to look forward, basically. That's kind of the purpose of today's webinar. Okay, so I need to click. All right, so there are mainly we can aggregate all of these aggregate shocks into four groups, where obviously the king of them is the health shock, which is the one that basically initiating and translating into all of the other aggregate shocks that we are now facing. So the COVID crisis obviously is the main reason why we have this major health problem at hand. And you know, this health shock, this COVID crisis immediately initiates also or translates into some supply shocks, you know, workers that become sick and stop going to work, and also some disruptions on the supply chains internationally. When this COVID started, for example, in China, there were a lot of examples that basically firms were facing even in Europe and throughout the rest of the world in terms of facing some challenges in rearranging their supply chains in order to maintain the production and the level of activity. And at the same time, the health shock, the COVID crisis also translates into some demand shocks in the sense that people immediately start, you know, being afraid of going out to some in particular they stop going into restaurants and all of these type of activities, economic activities that involve some risk of getting the disease. And these happen even before governments had strong reactions and imposed some social distancing. So obviously then in the cascading effect, you know, if firms stop being able to sell, you know, and start having issues in terms of supply, these also translate into some financial stress to these firms. And these firms, by being in financial stress, they have liquidity issues and they go to the banks, and this in itself can also cascade into a financial problem in the banking sector. And so all of these cascading effects, they reinforce themselves. And so I think there's never been, you know, a more important time to really taking into consideration very seriously general equilibrium effects, because all of these shocks are obviously interact with each other, and it's very important to pay close attention to all of them and how they also correlate with each other. So it's very important to understand these interactions. And there's been a lot of work recently, academically and non-academically, about this interaction, and it's crucial really to also have more data, not only about the health shocks, but also how the health shocks then interacts with all of these dimensions that I just mentioned, such as the demand shocks, supply shocks, and the financial shocks. Now, at the same time, obviously, the institutions are not just looking to the world and to use this huge fire that is catching on in the economy and doing nothing. Obviously, the governments are also reacting to this crisis, and these policy actions are in themselves aggregate shocks to the rest of the economy, in the sense that these policies are coming around the clock. There's no time, and a lot of these announcements also come as a surprise. Nobody really knows for sure how policies and how they would look like in the future. And so there's also this dimension that there's every single day new measures being taken by the government and by the monetary institutions that also create themselves some effects directly and indirectly to a lot of firms in the economy. So obviously the first ones being mainly regulatory, like social distancing and so on, and also regulatory in the sense of the labor market. So that's why we highlight here wages and salaries, in the sense that a lot of these regulatory measures were taken, such as flexibilization of layoffs and so on and so forth, that really try to target and maintain employment in the economy while we are facing this health crisis. Okay, now obviously this has a direct effect in the linkage of the economy of wages and salaries. But again, as I said, all of the economies are entirely connected, and by general equilibrium, by spillover effects, this obviously has indirect effects in all other parts of the economy. But here we are just highlighting the direct concern of most of the regulatory measures that were taken. Now, secondly, there's also been obviously a lot of fiscal policy actions by the government, and these has been mostly in the form of delaying taxes payments from the households to the government, also from firms to the government. And also there's been a lot of direct transfers around the world from the government to households, so direct assistance to families, but also a lot of direct, in some cases, a lot of direct transfers to firms as well. Okay, so there's been a lot of action there that has directly affected a lot of firms, and indirectly a lot of other firms that didn't receive the direct help, but because of the way that all the economy is interlinked, it basically also helps them indirectly by helping the economy not to collapse all at once. Then there is some financial measures, shocks that have been happening. And I would say here the main one that has been useful in sort of making sure that firms and families are not facing a huge liquidity crunch. It's basically moratories, so trying to delay these loan payments and interest payments, and this really has helped tremendously, directly and indirectly, the economy. And finally, the monetary authorities have really trying to help us smooth out these interest rates, these financial costs of financial intermediation. So really trying to lower or maintain under control the borrowing costs, and this is crucial for a lot of the stakeholders in the economy, and most importantly, really the government, because it's really important that the monetary authority makes sure that the borrowing conditions of the government, first of all, that the governments will always be able to borrow, and second of all, that they can borrow at the reasonable rates that do not, imply in the risk of these debts, these public debts, become unsustainable. Okay, so this is really crucial, and during this crisis, it's really crucial to sort of have some, smoothing, consumption smoothing. So we're basically, maintaining our spending in the economy today, on the promise that we'll pay for this with future production, future resources. And so in order to do this in the way that is as cheap as possible, the monetary authority is really crucial here. Okay, and pervading, what is very pervasive also around the economy right now. And I would say that if the health shock is the king, you know, certainly uncertainty is the queen. And there's a lot of uncertainty about a lot of especially there's tremendous uncertainty about the health issue at first. So we really have a lot of questions and a lot of things that we really don't understand. And we certainly lack a lot of data and testing capacity. So there's a lot of uncertainty on that. And moreover, there's also a lot of uncertainty on overall the shocks I just mentioned. And so that's one of the reasons, you know, the lights go out. And so really we are in the dark. And I would say that this is one of the main issues, and governments all around the world understand this. And, you know, without fixing the health problem, it's going to be very hard to fix the uncertainty part. And without uncertainty and without certainty, it's going to be very hard to have economies work effectively like we used to have. So we are really, you know, in a dark tunnel, moving all together. There is some light in the end of the tunnel. Now the question is, you know, how long is really this tunnel? And obviously, you know, vaccines and other types of treatment that if they show up would be great. It can basically help shorten this tunnel. But, you know, we don't know exactly how big it's going to be. But we need to keep moving forward. And then the question is, you know, how do we move forward? How do we keep moving forward? And so one little piece of this and how to move forward is really to ask the question, how do we reopen the economy? So who should go first? And here, obviously, the essential sector of, you know, essential goods, healthcare, obviously that is fighting the health crisis. This will need to be open regardless of the state of the health crisis. But now the question is, okay, but how do we reopen the remaining of the sectors that have been closed because of this crisis? And here I think it's useful to divide between two dimensions. One being the risk of transmission. We obviously want to open first sectors that have low level of risk of transmission, but at the same time, we also want to focus, you know, we want to bet against a little bit of this risk of transmission. We want to have the highest return possible for this risk, and obviously that has to do with what is the economic relevance of that sector. So I think it's very useful. We think it's very useful to basically place the sectors along these dimensions to try to figure out who should go first. So we have group, you know, A, where you have examples of sectors that, you know, have high risk of transmission and low economic relevance. Obviously here, the education institutions is discussable. We can discuss that. It's debatable because, you know, the education sector, although has maybe low value add in terms of GDP, it's one of the main, you know, investments in human capital. So you know, it's very important for future production. So it's not something that we should, you know, completely rule out as opening first. And also at the same time, you know, workers cannot go to work if they have to be taking care of their kids at home. So obviously this one I would take with a little bit of grain of salt. Then there are, you know, groups of sectors that, like real estate, that have sort of a medium economic relevance and also some medium risk of transmission. And then finally, there are sectors that, you know, where we want to really be moving along. We want to be, you know, at the upper corner of this figure, where we want to have, you know, low risk of transmission and high economic relevance. Obviously, here we're just, you know, giving big aggregate levels of industries, but obviously you could go to a higher degree of the granularity, and, you know, governments could in principle use the International Standard Industrial Classification, where they can basically try to place, you know, at another level of disaggregation, sectors around these dimensions to try to figure out how to gradually open up an economy in the best way possible. So at the same time, when this crisis rises, it doesn't rise for everyone, not in the same way, at least. And, you know, if we take a look at past crises, what we see is that, you know, the macro environment in general provides some context, but not fate, certainly. So there are firms, even, you know, in different sectors that do differently. That's something that we can already see. Like, for example, healthcare has typically done far better than other sectors in the past crisis. However, even within the same sector, you can see that there is some variation as well. So even within the health sector, you have firms that have seen, you know, some growth in their profit margins, and some others that have seen losses, and some others. So there is a lot of variation within across sectors and within the sector. So that's something that we need to think about. But then you can ask, okay, but this crisis is very different from the past crisis, for sure. So here we have a plot that has from year to date total shareholder returns for the top 3,000 companies in market cap in 2019, sorry. And so here you can see that again, obviously in this crisis, the across sector variation is even larger than before. So you see, because obviously of the nature that of the crisis we're facing in terms of that social distancing obviously affects very differently different sectors and different firms, different economic activity. But again, even within sectors, you see a lot of variation. And so again, you know, the macro environment provides context, but again, not fate. And with that, I want to pass along the word to my good friend and colleague, Pedro Brinca, that will discuss a little bit how firms should respond in such a way that they strive to defy fate and not just accept the fate of the macro context. Thank you.
Okay, João, thanks a lot. Now it's my turn. So again, thanks a lot for coming, and thanks for the nice first part, João. So now it's my turn to talk a little bit about what kind of challenges firms can or have to deal with. And this is especially important just because, as João showed, even between sectors, there's of course a lot of difference in performance. Some sectors, of course, are bound to be faring better in this crisis than others. But what's for me the most interesting part is that even within each sector, you have a very wide difference in performance between firms. So what this second half of the presentation is about is what kind of strategies and things that companies should be looking into in order to be among those top performers. Okay, and I'm going to talk about 6 main dimensions. One has to do with demand. We all know that, you know, some goods are in lack of demand. Everything that has to do with the gig economy, recreation, many sectors, they are observing a huge drop in demand. Some others are observing a spike. So this is a dimension that needs to be taken into account. Of course, the robustness of the supply chain. How well can you keep operating if you are operating, depending on how your suppliers provide you with everything that you need in order to do so. So that's another relevant dimension. A new dimension in this crisis is precisely the safety dimension. Okay, how can you operate, you know, observing the safety standards and so forth. There's policy issues that you need to think about, because there's a lot of debate on which policies can come and help companies, and you need to be aware of that too. This also is a big shock to your employees and workers, and how do they deal with that. And lastly, the one that everyone is, you know, well aware, is the big shock to finances, the cash flow disruption and so forth. But I'm going to talk about each one of these 6 dimensions, but in all of them, it's very important to create scenarios and check the resilience of your firm. How well is your firm equipped to deal with different scenarios that may come around? Because as João said, there's a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so the first one has to do with demand. So for demand is a bit erratic in the sense that for some firms, demand has spiked. For other firms, demand has almost disappeared. So what's really important, first of all, is to intensify communication with your customers. Okay, and because time is a limited resource, you should of course first focus on the large clients, the ones that buy the most volume and the most in terms of revenue. Okay, they're represent the biggest part of your revenue, because you want to make sure that you can anticipate these kind of shifts in demand, not just from your clients, of course, but the whole market in general. Some firms are pivoting production, for example. So we know of Portuguese firms, for example, that they were producing ear swabs, that they switched production to produce health swabs to test for the COVID disease. You have textile companies now making protective equipment for health professionals. You see people, you know, some firms producing masks. So to what extent can have a good feel of what is the market demanding right now and how easy it is for you to pivot production to meet those needs. But not just pivoting production, you also need to take into account that there's marketing and pricing decisions that need to be taken into account, because of course, just the fact that you produce these new goods doesn't get you anywhere. You need to, ensure effective channels of communication with the market for them to know that you are buying, that you are producing these goods so they can buy from you. If you are in the business to business market, it's important also that you communicate very well with your tier one customers, okay? So you can anticipate their own demand. And that's also very important. And at last, and we see this all over the place, like restaurants and so forth, try to think to what extent you can explore alternative channels for sales, okay? Whether you're in a business where doing transactions online is possible, home delivery, like in the restaurants and so forth, okay? So this is about demand. About supply, again, communication is key. You need to work with your suppliers to make sure that you are well aware of your supply chain risks, okay? What is the risk of disruption in getting the goods that you need in order to operate, okay? And this is much harder to do than it appears, because, there's a famous Portuguese company in the north of Portugal. They work in the leather industry. They didn't have any exposure to China at all. China was 3% of their exports. But what happened was that some of the components they use to dye the leather, they came from Switzerland and Germany. But the people producing these components, they bought other components from China. So even though Riopel, sorry, this was the name of the company, even though this company didn't have a direct connection to China, one of their suppliers had, and then they had to stop operating, okay? So try to identify these supply chain risks and rank them to make sure that you get the most important done first. Try to identify alternative suppliers. Obviously, that's the first strategy to look into. Another way that you can kind of minimize this risk of the supply chain is to build larger inventories, okay? To kind of build a buffer for that. And importantly, don't let supply disruptions affect or tarnish your reputation with your clients, okay? Clients right now, I guess they're bound to be a bit understanding, because they understand that, there's all sorts of disruptions going on, but you should make sure that the kind of communication you have with your customers is not impacted by delays on delivery and so forth. On the safety dimension, obviously, we need to aim to protect clients, employees, and suppliers, secure supply of protective gear, however challenging it may be, and this is important, operate under strict standards of operation safety, okay? Especially following recommendations from official health authorities. Not because it's the right thing, just because it's the right thing to do, but because it protects your company from future liability. The last thing you want is down the line, employees suing you in court because you didn't follow safety standards and endangered their working conditions, okay? Keep monitoring these standard operation procedures, because they are bound to change. Think about what you will win and you will lose by moving all possible workers to work from home. And one thing that people are kind of neglecting a lot, but we just saw with one big electricity company last week, I think, remember to protect company data, okay? As you move everyone online working from home, there are bound to be security breaches, so make sure that this dimension is well taken care of. Next, we have the policy dimension. Make sure that you follow all the policy proposals that are being discussed, okay? And make sure that you liaise and you talk with your industry associations or sectoral representatives to make sure that whoever is designing these policies, okay, takes the idiosyncratic needs of your business into account. Okay, this is very important. Some of the measures initially kind of neglected a good part of the industry, and policies were being designed that were not really effective in some sectors. So sectors need to make themselves heard on policymakers to make sure that, the right policies are developed. And the last two are also very important. Whatever help is coming, it's almost sure that it will be conditional on you having a good relationship with the government, with the tax authorities, and that you can provide financial reports and statements to the authorities that will be giving out all this help. Okay, so make sure that those are into shape. Also, in terms of the workforce, of course, you need to flexibilize work schedules, especially for people who are working from home whenever possible. You have to think about that people are at home taking care of their kids, you know, with other people working at the home and so forth. So if possible, try to flexibilize these working arrangements. Key performance indicators have never been more important, because if people are at home and effort is less observable, then of course, the use of KPIs is determinant. Many people are very resistant to change, and not everyone knew how to handle these digital tools that we are now using. And it's important that to make sure they are most productive, that they are not kept in the dark for a good part of the time trying to figure out how things work. So roll out training programs if you can, and let employees participate in the definition of the new normal. I mean, we are kind of sailing in uncharted territory here, even in terms of human resources management and so forth. And it's really, really important that you hear constant feedback from your employees, especially to prevent burnout. Okay, most sectors, there are many sectors where people kind of idle at home, they can't do much, but there are other sectors where people are working twice as hard, okay, because they have to do everything they did before, but on top of that, they have to adapt to the new channels of communication, maybe, you know, adapt materials to communicate and so forth. So that's very important. And lastly, finances. Okay, so this is one of the big ones, right? So you have a big, if you have a big drop in demand, you'll have a big drop in cash flows, and liquidity is a big thing. This can mean the difference between your firm closing or staying open. Okay, in some firms where, or some businesses like, you know, the hotel industry and so forth, where they have very high cash flow needs, this can be really the deal breaker for the company to stay alive. So stress test your cash needs. Okay, think about the best case scenario, worst case scenario. See how hard, how well prepared is your company to survive this. Try to reduce fixed costs to the maximum. I know this is not very popular thing to say, but if you have temporary workers, you might, and you have a drop in demand, this might be the rational thing to do, to think about whether it makes sense to keep them. Try to shift the workload to the permanent workforce that you can't separate. But again, labor should be always the last resort, because you're going to be destroying a lot of firm-specific organizational capital that was built during the relationship with these people. Engage with financial partners to ensure credit supply and renegotiate maturity. Okay, this means that if you have credit lines, if you are paying off loans, try to negotiate with the banks now. Okay, now is already, you know, you should have done it yesterday, to make sure that you can extend your payments through time. Okay, if liquidity becomes a big thing in your company, try to think about factoring these receivables. I mean, you're bound in this time to pay a high discount rate, but, you know, if that's the only way to survive, you have to do it. And then remember that as you try to diversify your supply chain, this is determined to bring extra costs. Okay, so make sure you take that into account when planning for your cash flow needs in the future and building those different scenarios. So how will the world look after COVID-19? Okay, so this is how I'm going to end. First, what I think is going to happen is that we're going to have more diversified supply chains. I guess everyone realized that, you know, the just-in-time kind of mentality of keeping stocks to very, very low to make sure that these costs are also very low and so forth, in an environment with a big risk on supply chains, can actually be not the smartest strategy to follow. So, of course, costs will increase, because diversifying, of course, will mean that you'll have to support higher costs. Local will gain appreciation, but actually this supply chain risk is something that was a little bit already on the table because about all the trade wars, okay? And these things that were brought up by China and the US mainly, but also between the US and Europe and so forth. So I think this COVID crisis is gonna exacerbate that dimension, and, you know, diversified supply chains will become an issue and a key performance indicator, or a key indicator that the firm will want to make sure that it's well taken care of. Of course, online, I think, is bound to become the new normal. I think there's a lot of people who are resistant to change. And now we're forced to do a lot of transactions and a lot of stuff online. This will represent a big shift. People will not unlearn these new ways of buying things. Of course, as we move online, this will lead to heightened competition, okay? It's much easier to compare prices when you're browsing than it is to compare prices when you have to physically walk from one store to the other. Okay, so firms have to be prepared for a tougher competition along the price dimension. And the direct consequence of this is also that in-store shopping and commercial real estate are bound to take a hit. Okay, if this is a trend that becomes here to stay, they are bound to take a hit. Okay. Next, new health standards are here to stay. I think we have a picture here of a little kid being measured his temperature at the airport in East Asia. So of course, this fear of the new pandemic that was instilled in us will ensure stricter sanitary checks, both on cargo and passengers. And this will translate into heightened costs of doing business. And I guess a lot of business travel is gonna move online. I think people are realizing how many physical meetings were actually kind of useless, and you could have done them through these online methods. And another trend that I'm expecting to happen is that all these peta-health movements, like people anti-vaccination and kind of, you know, peta-health businesses, they're bound to take a hit, because I guess none of them has come with a solution, and everyone is waiting for the actual traditional medicine to lead that effort. The last two things I want to talk about is, one, we witnessed catastrophic job and firm destruction in some countries. Look at the US. We're talking about over 20 million people lost their jobs in just 4 weeks. And the private sector is not good at all in insuring people against these risks when the risk is systemic, when the risk affects everyone. Private system is very good at pooling risks, but not so much at dealing with aggregate risk. And this will push forward the role of public insurance. Okay, and the most obvious case is precisely the health industry. Many people are now discovering that their private health plans do not cover epidemics. Okay, so yeah, so this will be a big push towards universal healthcare and so forth. And also remember that after the crisis of 2008 and then the 2011 in Europe, the institutional response was really strong, and the general perception, both at the population and in governments, were that these big interventions actually did some good. They were very successful. So today, the political kind of attitude or atmosphere towards strong interventions is much more welcoming. So I believe these public insurance interventions are going to become more predominant. Okay. And lastly, another thing that the new world will look like, we're bound to look at the much more unequal world economy. First, as João starts showing, the crisis is not affecting everyone equally, be it countries, sectors, firms, or households. Okay, and there are trends in automation and trends in offshoring that are bound to change. Okay, so one thing is, as we know, that international trade just became a little bit more risky, a little bit being the key qualifier in this case. Firms will try to produce closer to where they operate. The problem with that is that labor costs are going to be higher. So the incentives to come up with machines that can substitute routine work and so forth is going to increase. Okay, so we're bound to see some reshoring, but I'm not sure that will translate in such a large increase in demand for labor back at home, because many of those tasks are going to be probably automated. And remember that this is a crisis that is hitting the poor the hardest. Okay, it's a disease that attacks mostly people that already have other diseases, which is mostly, you know, poor people tend to be overrepresented among these groups. It tends to hit, for example, the reshoring and so forth tends to hit the people who have lowest instruction and they are doing more routine kind of indifferentiated tasks. And all of these effects are very likely to become permanent. Okay, so thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Me and João will now be available to take some questions.
Hello all again, and thank you for your questions. We have some of them here. I will start with a question for João. Where can we draw the line between social distancing and economics protection in countries, for instance, like Brazil? Won't poverty lead to a worse scenario of both debts and a sinking economy?
So the social distancing and economic performance are intertwined. So it's actually very different to, very difficult to evaluate this as like a trade-off. In some senses, you're bound to have an economic crisis and health crisis, or maybe just an economic crisis. So I don't think just removing social distancing is actually in some way gonna exacerbate just the health problem and diminish the economic problem. I don't think that that's going to happen, but for sure I understand the concern, and I agree that for some countries and for some populations within these countries that are very low income, have very little resources, this can become a very problematic issue. And I think in that case the government should try even more, I guess, to provide as much as it can social insurance, like Pedro mentioned, to these people, because without this social insurance, obviously it's very hard to make them commit to social distancing, and without them committing to social distancing, we just prolong the negative economic effects and the health effects. And moreover, these people, again, that are the ones that have the lower resources, are going to be the ones that were going to be overrepresented in the mortality rates we're going to see, like Pedro mentioned. So all of this makes me think that it's going to be very hard to actually separate these two issues.
Susanne, you're muted.
Sorry. There's lots of people here asking about tourism. I'm not sure who's the best to answer, Pedro or João. But I will. How can Portugal stay ahead of? No, not this one. Sorry. So how do you think that tourism will react? How can tourism come out of this crisis, especially in Portugal, where or in as well as other countries in the southern part of Europe, where tourism plays a big role?
Maybe I can take it. I've been writing a little bit about the sector. So tourism is a big challenge. So let me start with one of the challenges. It's one of the most leveraged industries. They have a lot of debt, because when they open these resources, hotels and stuff like that, and I'm now talking about those kind of companies from the sector of tourism, they have to invest a lot in infrastructure and equipment. And these are fixed costs. So if demand drops, it's not like they can scale down costs. So they have very high leverage ratios. And these are the kind of companies that will have the biggest challenge in terms of cash flow disruption. And they really need an intervention, some help to provide liquidity to stay afloat, or it's like one of the first to disappear. That's crystal clear. The second thing is, the second challenge that this industry has is precisely the fact that tourism is very volatile, okay, in terms of kind of international dynamics. This big crisis will instill some fear on people for traveling, okay? And I believe, at least for this summer, for Portugal, one of the big challenges is precisely to kind of, for people to be confident that they can go on vacation. Now, bear in mind that, of all the demand for tourism services in Portugal, 2/3 comes from Portuguese nationals, okay? So if flights are disrupted, okay, and there's some uncertainty about international links on air travel and so forth, they should try to turn to the internal demand, to the Portuguese market, okay? Because it's very easy for someone in Lisbon, take the car and go to Algarve, okay? Or, to keep it balanced among touristic regions, to visit the beautiful north. So that's for sure one of the things that these companies can do. Now, one thing that gives me hope is that we have some of the best people in the tourism industry. The tourism industry in Portugal has developed a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. They're amongst the most qualified people in the industries all across the world. What they need to do is to put all that great human capital into thinking that this can be an opportunity. There will be a lot of disruptions on the channels. People are going to be looking for places to go. It's like a big shock on people's preferences, and consumers are going to be around up for grabs, and the people who can be more creative, design the best sales approaches, and design the best packages are going to be the ones who are going to reap the benefits of capturing these consumers.
Yeah, I would just add to that, just I agree with everything Pedro said. I just say is, yes, I agree that trying to stay afloat is crucial to really, make the most out of our internal demand. Obviously, it doesn't make up to the external demand. Obviously, that's going to be impossible. It's just a dream that is enough to basically have the same level of revenues that we used to have. But obviously, it might be enough to stay afloat until conditions, improve all around the globe and confidence is back. And at the same time, could take this opportunity, like Peter said, to invest actually in the labor force. Given now that the opportunity cost in terms of economic activity is lower, in the way that it's possible, it might be a good time to actually invest in the labor force, in the reskilling that was already needed, in order to reshape the best we can our labor force to the future when economic activity returns in full force.
And let me just add one final point is, we have a market there. We compete with Spain, and Spain is a much bigger mess than we are. We compete with Italy, which is a much bigger mess than we are. And we compete with North Africa, especially Tunisia, which have been seeing exponential growth on tourism. That is the big threat, because we gained a lot with all the Arab Spring stuff in North Africa that coincide a little bit with the sovereign debt crisis that put Portugal on the international news. But the north of Africa has calmed down. They haven't been particularly hit by the disease. So they're right now our biggest threat, in my opinion.
So you were talking about Africa. So maybe you think that the emerging markets could be the saviors for this economic crisis?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think they're going to be actually probably even, more strongly hit because they also depend a lot on external conditions on the rest of the world, which is basically going to be in very bad shape. And secondly, their governments don't have the fiscal space that most of the governments have in terms of fiscal space in the developed countries. So I actually don't think there's going to be, say, winners relative to, in terms of economic growth, economic performance, say, comparing developed versus developing countries. I don't believe in that. I think there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity among these groups, and that's my opinion.
And just to add one thing to what João said, I agree with him. If you look at 2018, China alone was responsible for 39% of the global growth. Okay, and if you look at the Shanghai stock market index, it had a huge fall with the Chinese crisis at the beginning, but it had a much deeper crisis, a much deeper drop in the stock market after the crisis became predominant in Europe and the US, which kind of fits in with a country that today is the biggest exporter in the world and the second biggest importer.
So we were talking about tourism, and how about green growth, green industries? Do you think this is the time to push for the development of this type of industries, or maybe they are too costly?
I always believe it's the time to push for those industries, but that's my opinion. But no, seriously, it's going to be hard because we have a lot of constraints in terms of resources, and so the opportunity costs of investing in those type of industries are very, very large. And secondly, the oil price is at the record low. So these two things combined make me think that it's going to be very hard to incentivize people strongly to invest in green type of technologies and growth.
Now, a question directly to Pedro. How to ensure the public insurance covers in case of catastrophe like pandemic, climate, or earthquake, as these risks are becoming more frequent, severe, with bigger impact?
Well, one way, okay, so you cannot diversify systemic risk. If you live in a closed economy with no contact with the if the planet Earth gets hit by an asteroid, there's nothing you can do, okay? You can't really ask for help from the moon or Mars, right? But of course, each country is not a planet in itself. So one thing that we can do, and the European Union has played that role, is precisely to mutually insure each other on events like this. So when we're talking about big disruptions, this insurance takes places. Okay? They deal with the asymmetric effects. They cannot deal with hitting the whole area, for example, all of Europe or European Union as a whole. Okay, but if one country is particularly affected, let's say for a flood or a fire or so forth, in the US, for example, they are much more, they are built to a much stronger level, but in Europe, that capability is being built. Now, even within country, we cannot insure exactly against shocks that affect us as a whole, but we can, and I'm going to use a forbidden word, socialize the impacts. Okay, we can socialize the impacts in the sense that
share losses.
You can pursue redistributive policies if you believe that, for example, from a normative standpoint, that's what you should do to compensate the people that were affected. Okay, and this could be done, for example, in a closed economy. When you inject liquidity in the system, creating inflation, what you're doing is basically socializing the cost of bringing up the economy. Okay.
Today we talked about a lot about the crisis impact on the several sectors. Do you think that all the measures that we suggested in this presentation can be implemented in all industries? If not, which industries or type of firms will struggle the most to overcome this crisis?
I think firms that are more exposed to in terms of the demand shock of the coronavirus, I think are the most exposed for sure. So firms that are more exposed to the big drop in demand going forward, as long as this health crisis lasts, and I think there's now, unfortunately, a high chance that it's going to take a long time until we get a vaccine or a treatment that can basically solve, sort of to say, this health problem, so that people can have enough confidence to bring back the demand for those firms in those sectors. I think those are the most exposed ones. And it's really hard to really know how to deal with that in the sense that stimulus, there's very little that the government can typically in this crisis provide, demand stimulus, right? So, but in this case, I think it's going to be hard to provide stimulus enough so that people, will risk their health, over just getting those products or services. So I think it's going to be very complex, the problem to deal with that the government has to face now in this second phase, let's say, of reopening the economy, because the social insurance policies, I think that was a bit more clear what to do. But now in terms of stimulus policies, in terms of the recovery of the economy, accelerating this recovery, I think it's a bit more tricky, and we need to think carefully about it.
One thing that is absolutely key is to provide liquidity so they can smooth this negative demand shock over time. So in Portugal, for example, initially the plan was to provide liquidity by having 1 year not having to pay back, and then having 4 years to pay back all the loan. This has been revised to give 1.5 years of no paybacks and up to 6 years of paying back the actual loan. So the further away in the time horizon firms can smooth this shock, the less it will have on the market that they're going to lose when operating, and of course on their competitiveness. Okay, so that's pretty much what it can do, but it has to be done with some care, because we entered into this crisis thinking that it would be a V-shaped crisis, like we're going to go down and then we're going to come up a lot. But what we have seen is that we might have some structural changes. Okay, and on one hand, you want to make sure that the viable companies survive and that jobs and firms are not destroyed, because that's very costly from an economic perspective. That can make the economy recover really slow. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that you don't want to distort the incentives to move into the sectors that the economy now is able to sustain. Okay, so it's a tough balance.
I just want to say that it's crucial for the government to have like business to business information, like the other countries have been doing. And I think in Portugal, it's crucial for us to also start doing that, having billions of, we could use bank data or some other type of data, so that to have an input output structure of the economy in real time. I think it's crucial to understand better what to do in terms of stimulus policies or liquidity policies that Pedro just mentioned. I think, like the coronavirus, we need to have very, very good data about it, of the health situation, but we also need to have a lot of good data in real time, in high frequency of the economic activity.
Okay, so now the last question, because we are closing in on surpassing the time we had available. Taking into consideration that Portugal has lots of small and medium companies, in your opinion, what are the most effective ways for governments to support these smaller companies?
Okay, so some of the ideas we already discussed them, right? You need to provide liquidity. Small business, a small, medium company, depending on the kind of sector and business that they are in, they might only have liquidity to operate or to be open until what, for 7 weeks, 6 weeks. So liquidity is determinant. I think the layoff and the simplified layoff measure was one of the best thought policies that could have been adopted. It's preventing a lot of job destruction, which is, again, as I said, is one of the key dimensions to make sure that the recovery is going to take up quicker, right? Because you're not destroying the worker-firm relationship. So when things become better, firms don't have to spend a lot of time and resources looking for the right worker. Once they found him, they don't have to wait 1 or 2 or 3 months until he becomes productive and learns the ropes. This is what makes the big difference. Now, the small, medium companies that you referred, they have some specific problems that have to do with shorter or higher cash flow sensitivity, and that is one relevant dimension that needs to be taken care of. Yeah.
I just want to add is it's crucial for the micro firms that do not have this access to the online market, the big online market. So I'm not talking about the startups and those type of small companies. I'm talking about the traditional sector type of small companies, micro firms. And for those, it's crucial to reduce the uncertainty, and it's crucial for the government to not fail when we reopen the economy. So the credibility that the government, or for whatever in the world the government's won over with these policies of social distancing, it's very important to keep that credibility going forward, so that these businesses can have finally the demand return to their businesses. Otherwise, people are just going to buy everything online and not going to the local shops. So it's crucial, I think, for them in terms of government policy. The crucial part is really get this reopening of the economy going without, again, getting the health problem out of control. And this is crucial. And it's tough, and I think it's very important for governments around the globe. It's something I've been talking with Pedro, to have not only the plan A of like how we're going to reopen the economy, but also have the plan B in place, so that people understand how we need to partially close down we might need to partially close down the economy going forward. It's very important to know how to do this. Otherwise, we are in the risk of panicking again. Create a big panic because we see the things going out of control, and then we just need to close everything down again. And I don't think those micro firms can survive that. They can.
Let me just add one final thought, just to close.
Just one final.
Before Susanna hits me. I mean, there's a big debate now between should we open, should we not open, and what is key to have in mind is that the most productive discussion is not about whether we should open or not, because it's obvious that we can't stay closed forever. So the most productive discussion is to talk about specific measures, like what does it mean to kind of ease the confinement? What does that mean? I mean, specifically, what policy are we talking about? And we have to go one by one. So if it's about letting kids go back to school, I want the people from epidemiology to tell me what is the expected impact that will have in the number of infected people, and the number of people who are going to be expected to be committed to the hospital, the number of people that, given that they are committed to the hospital, are going to end up in the intensive care unit, and the number of people who are going to die. Because then we can do some risk-benefit analysis and we can analyze these policies. But we need economists and public health specialists working together, sharing information and debating these things, because otherwise it's going to be like walking on the dark and much harder, because the decision, of course, can't be purely economic for obvious reasons. I'm not an epidemiologist, so it has to do, all those health things have to be answered by epidemiologists. And only working together, we can make sure that, we have not only the best recovery possible, but also the most sure recovery possible.
Okay, so thank you, Pedro. Thank you, João. Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you for your questions. I hope you enjoyed being with us today. Don't forget that we will have much more webinars every day at 6 p.m. You can find them on our platform at rolltoplay.novasbe.pt. So thank you all for being here and have a nice weekend.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.